I can't say that to like a taxi driver that we used, you know, you get in the taxi with all your gear cases. What kind of music do you make? Oh, it's mid-fi synthwave, so much fun. What? You know? I like to call my music mid-fi synthwave slow motion funk. It's got a little bit of everything that I find very inspiring. Mid-fi is right in the middle. It's not hi-fi, it's not lo-fi, obviously, it's mid-fi. And that just comes from, you know, older recordings. I feel like they had that quality. Synthwave synthesizers are extremely inspiring. You know, I love those early polysynths, and there's just something about, you know, 2 oscillators, 1 detune just a hair. It does it for me. You don't need much else. Slow motion, you know, I like down-tempo music. I think, you know, coming from drum and bass and, you know, kind of filtering down through the years, it's my sort of peaceful music. I've taken quite a break from, you know, the up-tempo stuff that I'm feeling a little bit more comfortable about getting into it again, because I think I left doing up-tempo music because I felt really pressured. Music didn't feel fun to write anymore for me, at least. I felt like I was just chasing techniques that were just constantly changing and evolving, and I felt like I was just so focused on that, I wasn't really focused on writing music. I think for me, with Truise, funk music is kind of what shaped the sound. From the bass, the synth bass, the early synth bass, to the drum machines, the writing style, the recording techniques. So when I originally got into kind of, you know, synth pop, you know, I kind of listened to all the popular stuff. Everybody, you know, you hear it throughout the years. I heard it growing up, you know, here and there through parents', you know, record collection. I think I finally felt like I could get to a place on my own with synth pop where I could start digging a little deeper. And there's so much beyond it. And then when you go from that and just finding funk, I think that was just a huge change for me. That's why it's mid-fi synthwave slow motion funk. I think that was also my stab at like I said before, was kind of my dig at genres and feeling kind of boxed in. So I made my own giant kind of hodgepodge of a label to really, you know, to say, I guess it doesn't really matter. In my music, I definitely get lumped into the, you know, kind of 80s nostalgia wave that came about in the past, I'd say 10 years, no, a decade of it. It feels like. I never wanted to write music that felt like 80s music. I really just wanted to take my favorite parts of that decade, and even before early synthesis, take my favorite parts of it, but try to update it just enough to where it's interesting, but it still has that quality. It's more of a production quality. It's not necessarily a songwriting quality. I remember consciously sitting in my apartment when I lived in New Jersey when I was really just starting this project, thinking like, I really love these drum sounds, but how can I make them not the 80s, you know? You can hear it, you know, you hear some of the, you know, the detuned Lindrum rim shot, you know, it's just, that's Prince right there, you can't deny it, you know? Taking that sound and incorporating it into something new, I think is what it's all about. It's basically, it's almost sampling in a way. It's just about how you know, the implementation of what you're borrowing, you know, and how it works in your creative process and product, you know? I could name the first 3 CDs I had. One was No Doubt, Tragic Kingdom, 311, and Bone Thugs and Harmony, established 1999. It's quite the journey for me. Nine Inch Nails was a huge inspiration to shaping me musically, I believe. It was a blend of, you know, rock music, which is kind of what I was into when I was young. And it was a blend of electronic music as well, which I wasn't really into either. So I think the marriage of those two, you know, their sound kind of opened the door for me to different genres of music. I kind of, you know, went from Nine Inch Nails into Chemical Brothers. Chemical Brothers and The Prodigy were really what got me into electronic music. I come from a small town, so it was kind of, you know, what I saw on MTV And, then I kind of branched out and found out about drum and bass music, Bad Company, Current Value. There's so many. As far as drum and bass music goes, I think I gravitated towards the aggressiveness of it. It was like nothing I had ever heard before, this heart pounding music kind of, just really just it sucked me right in. And that's when I first started to think about writing music. Other artists like Boards of Canada, obviously, was a huge inspiration to me. They're probably my all-time favorite. Their ability to really convey emotion through the music without using words is something that really had an impact on me. And, I think I came from, being heavily interested in genres of music that were, very focused on drums. And I felt that I kind of missed the melody for a long time. So when I found out about Boards of Canada, it just totally changed. I think it changed who I was. And then that kind of shifted into me, falling in love with the 80s, vintage synthesizers and drum machines and things like that, kind of getting into funk and a little bit of hip hop and things like that, which I think is, kind of what culminated into the Truise project. When I fall in love with music, I think sometimes I fall in love with that one sound. I'm not necessarily listening to the song, I'm listening to the sound of the sounds in the song. I really try to focus and learn from every specific sound in songs that I really enjoy. What EQs did they use? What compressors did they use? The technical side of it, yes, but how did they capture that character? When I was listening to something, I would try to figure out which console did they use, what channel strips, and how did they, even if you can't really hear it, and just knowing it inside for me is very inspiring. You know what I mean? Even if it's extremely nuanced, what producers certain artists work with, and you can kind of listen to their catalog and see how they touched certain artists in certain ways. I find that part of music to be very interesting. If, say, the drums and the programming and the sound, the tone, the overall quality really spoke to me, I would do a fair amount of research on those drums. I would research who programmed it, what equipment was used, the time period. I would use whatever resource was available, Discogs, or if I could get my hands on the vinyl, to read the liner notes and get as much information as I could. And if it was an artist that used like a session musician just to come in and program the drum machine, then I would look up that session musician and find everything that he did. A lot of the time I don't really care who the artist is. It's more about, who worked on the music. That whole process of the research really helps me, kind of keep my inspiration, For one example, I would say Prince. His work with drum machines is incredible. He took those machines and really changed the landscape of the way people use them, as far as, different tunings. You could think as far back as Martin Hannett, who, worked with Joy Division, and, he took a certain piece of equipment, the AMS DMX. It's the reason those Joy Division drums sound like they do is because they were recorded using that specific equipment in that certain way. And I think I'm less inspired by music itself as opposed to being inspired by the equipment and the details and what's behind it. Look backward and kind of see how things were done, and see if you can take some of those processes, acquire some of those things, which can be difficult, but try to implement them in what you are creating, and see if you can bring it into the future, because they shouldn't be forgotten. My advice to musicians is to really do the research behind the music, learn about the equipment, and learn about the people who used it, and as far back as you can go. I still do those, that kind of research sometimes to seek out certain information about certain tracks or certain people involved in certain tracks or records, or even whole labels. You had to go into record shops to find it, for a long time. It was not online. You'll find so much extra inspiration by learning, the history of all this stuff. A lot of people just listen to music and they're like, oh, I love that song, and then that's it, then that inspires them enough to go write a song that's, inspired by, what they heard. But when you go in and look at the detail and just, I don't know, and then you kind of immerse yourself and you try to think about, oh, what was it like programming this drum machine in the studio at that time? How did they do it? Like, how long did it take? Say you're researching on Discogs and you're reading liner notes about, what synths they used, who was programming them, who was playing them, who was recording them, reading that information to me, like, kind of teleports me back to that moment. I feel like I can kind of wonder and feel it's that sort of kind of loosely kind of flowing dream state, I guess, is where I kind of live when I'm reading those things, like just imagining, really what it was like back then. And I find, that really inspires me alone, just being like, oh man, I wish it was like, 1988 and then I'm just smashing on the Oberheim DMX and, just making hits, that's what inspires me. And, I would say while researching, take notes if you gotta. Immerse yourself completely in all of this history and imagine yourself part of it. And, and then imagine if it was you in that situation, how would you take those certain things and make them your own?